We're here today visiting the Blakemore Lab in Cambridge at the invitation of its founder and principal investigator, Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore. The Blakemore Lab is based at the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge and the UCL Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in London. Their research focuses on the development of social cognition, peer influence and decision-making in the adolescent brain and adolescent mental health. They run large-scale behavioural studies in schools and in the lab, as well as neuroimaging studies with adolescents and adults. Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore is Professor of Psychology at the University of Cambridge, an Honorary Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL and leader of the Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience group. She has published over 140 papers in science journals and has won multiple major awards for her research and academic work. She was named in the Times Young Female Power List of 2014 and was one of only 4 scientists on the Sunday Times 100 Makers of the 21st Century 2014. Her work on teenage brains has brought it into the public's consciousness in a variety of ways. She has written a number of books, including The Learning Brain, Lessons for Education with Professor Uta Frith in 2005 and Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain in 2019. Hi, Sarah-Jayne. Thank you very much for inviting us to the Blakemore Lab. Can you first of all give us a little bit of a background, I suppose, about the purpose of the Blakemore Lab? Maybe it's USB.
Sure, yeah. So I've been leading this lab for the last 20 years, initially at UCL in London and now at Cambridge. And the main focus of our work is on the development of the teenage brain and behaviour. And the reason we are interested in this subject is because until about 25 years ago, nothing was known about how the human brain changes. In fact, when I was an undergraduate in the mid-90s, I was taught that the human brain stops developing in childhood. And I know that because I remember my undergraduate lectures, and I also kept my undergraduate textbooks, which are on this bookshelf here, and that's exactly what they say. So just, almost 30 years ago, it was assumed by neuroscientists that the human brain stops developing in childhood. We now know that that's completely false, and we know that because we now have the technology to look inside the living human brain and to track how the brain changes across age. And what that research has shown is that adolescence is a period of very substantial development, both in terms of the brain and in terms of cognition and behaviour, particularly social behaviour, and that's what we're really interested in.
Exciting stuff, very exciting stuff. So much information there. Reflections on progress so far. I believe the Blakemore Lab has now been running for over 15 years. So progress so far, have we made some progress into really understanding the adolescent brain?
I think so. I mean, the progress, of course, is not just the work we've done, but many labs around the world work in this area, and together the research has really progressed the field and really kind of revolutionised our understanding of how young people change during the period of adolescence, which we define as this very extended period of development from age 10 to 24 years. In terms of progress made by our lab and others, we're particularly interested in the development of the social brain, that is the network of brain regions that are involved in understanding other people's minds, their emotions, their behaviour. And we've, like others, have shown that the social brain network is a network of brain regions that undergoes really substantial development during adolescence and into the early mid-20s, and at the same time social behaviours and social cognition change, so young people get better at mentalising, which is the ability to read other people's minds and understand their mental states and emotions, and they also change in terms of their processing of the social world. So we know that in adolescence peers become particularly important. Young people are more likely than children or adults to evaluate themselves in terms of what their peers think of them. So peers become more and more important during adolescence, and we've shown, for example, that adolescents are particularly susceptible to being influenced by their peers. They show a heightened propensity for peer influence compared with children or adults. And That's really interesting because a lot of research is focused, for example, on risk-taking in adolescents, the fact that adolescents take more risks than other age groups. And by risks, I mean we tend to typically focus on risks like smoking and binge drinking and taking drugs and dangerous driving, those kinds of potentially dangerous risks. And what our research has shown, as well as other labs' research, is that what the critical factor seems to be whether young people are with their peers, because those kinds of risks, young people, if they take them, they're much more likely to take them when they're with their friends than when they're on their own. And it's the critical sort of social context influence of peers which seems to determine adolescent typical risk-taking.
So the sort of risk of losing out with your friends, the immediate risk, is greater for the adolescent than the fear of, I don't know, the impact of smoking in 20, 25 years' time.
That's exactly right. That's exactly our theory, that adolescents actually are very avoidant of social risk-taking. They want to avoid the risk of being socially excluded by their peers, because for them it's really important for adaptive evolutionary reasons to be included by their peer network, their group of friends. So they're very motivated to avoid being ostracised, being excluded, which is why they might go along with their friends, even if their friends are taking part in some kind of health risky or legal risky behaviour, because they place more weight on the social risk element and avoiding that than other types of risks like health risks or legal risks.
You had a lovely anecdote, I think, in your book about a friend of yours, I believe, who used to sing to his children in the grocery store supermarket, and at a certain point the singing became, "No, Dad, don't do it, don't do it."
Well, yeah, that's a different element of adolescent typical behaviour. Sudden, very profound feelings of embarrassment in front of one's parents. I mean, interesting behavioural development that is pretty ubiquitous amongst teenagers.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. Which leads us nicely on to, I work in a school, a very large secondary school. Have you come across anything that you believe is sort of transferable yet, that we could, in a sense, apply to an educational sort of environment?
It's a really good question. It's a question I'm asked a lot. Like, what are the kind of, simple messages for schools? How can they change pedagogy and school practice on the basis of this new neuroscience research? And actually, it's probably not quite there yet. There are no kind of simple quick fixes, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. So first of all, knowledge. I mean, the fact that, like I mentioned at the start of this interview, until 25 years ago, we didn't know anything about the teenage brain. Now we know a lot about the teenage brain and teenage behaviour, and just imparting that knowledge to teachers, parents, and even teenagers themselves is often found to be really useful. Knowing why some teenagers behave in a certain way, what is the underlying biology, helps people become more empathetic with the teenagers they look after or they teach. And also, I think, a lot of teenagers actually find it quite helpful themselves, and also for them to see the trajectory of brain behaviour and brain development and behavioural development, and the fact that it levels out in the 20s. Well, when I was a teenager, going through all that kind of turmoil and transition period of the teenage years, knowing that it would stabilise at some point would have been really useful. So imparting knowledge, I think, is really useful in schools, and bringing in more information, for example, in PSHE lessons about teenage brain development, I think would be a very useful thing. There are certain elements of the research which are also useful for schools to know about. So, for example, this isn't actually my area, but lots of people in the area of adolescent development research focus on sleep, the importance of sleep. Sleep is so vital for learning, for brain development, for mood, mental health, and
is that the Russell Foster?
Russell Foster is the main pioneer of this research. What his research has shown is that there are biological reasons for this, for the fact that teenagers need sleep and get probably less sleep than they need. There are actually biological and social reasons, but Russell Foster's research shows that melatonin, which is the sleep-inducing hormone that is produced in our brains in the evening, it responds to the lowering of light. it's produced about 2 hours later in teenagers' brains after puberty than it is in young children or adults' brains. And what that means is that teenagers don't get sleepy until later in the evening, so they don't want to go to sleep early anymore. And it also means that they find it harder to get up in the morning because they still need the same amount of sleep. So, you know, they get woken up in the middle of their biological night, made to go to school and learn lessons. And one consequence of this research is that some researchers have tried to push for school start times to be delayed until 10 o'clock. Now, in this country, as Russell Foster will say, young people don't start school until 8:30 or 9 a.m, which is still early, but it's a lot later than, for example, in other European countries and in the US, where they can start school as early as 7 or 7:30 a.m. So I think the issue isn't as critical in this country as it is in other countries. There are also, of course, social reasons for young people not getting enough sleep. Social media, their phones, you know, their educational days and after school time is taken up with so much learning and extracurricular activities that the kind of only downtime they get is often in the evenings, and they like to interact with their friends. Peers are really important. With their phones, a lot of teenagers sleep with their phones. That's absolutely common. And even respond to messages in the middle of the night or allow their phones to wake them up, because the social world plays such a huge importance in their development, but it's not good for sleep. So sleep is there is a lot known about the importance of sleep in adolescence. There's a lot of evidence for that, and again, that could have implications for school. Like Russell Foster has an intervention around educating parents, young people, teachers about the need for good quality sleep. Another area which I'll just touch on briefly is assessment. So I've been involved with a couple of different organisations, the Times Education Commission, which reported last year, 2022, and Rethinking Assessment, which is still ongoing, where we discussed, there was a particular focus on assessment in this country. So the large number of exams, tests that children and young people go through in this country, and whether really the very large number of exams we impose on kids in this country is necessary and is suited to what we know about how their brains and minds are changing, and particularly focusing around GCSEs, because we have this large number of GCSEs. GCSEs have become more linear, by which I mean less coursework, more focus on exams. So now young people often have 25 exams to sit in the summer. At the same time, this country has changed its policy, so now young people have to stay in some form of educational training until 18. And so they have two sets of really high stakes national exams at both 16 and 18. And the question is that really necessary? Most countries in which young people have to stay in some form of education until 18 don't have exams, or not such high stakes exams, both at 16 and 18. We still do. And the problem here is that, firstly, if you look at how teenagers' minds are changing, this is a period of, sensitivity to learning, to creativity, passion, is cramming their minds full of information which they then have to, rote learn and regurgitate in exams. Is that really best suited to this time of this sensitive period of heightened neuroplasticity, heightened learning, heightened creativity? And the second question is around mental health. So we know that most mental health problems first start before the age of 24. And there's a peak in the onset of internalizing problems like emotional problems like depression, anxiety, eating disorders at around the age of 16, which is exactly the age at which we're getting young people to do a huge number of very stressful exams. And if you ask young people, what are the most stressful things in your life? Survey after survey shows that number one is exam stress and academic pressure.
So are policymakers listening at the moment? Because there seems to be an awful lot of knowledge, information that they could be taking on board and responding to, certainly from an educational point of view. Are they hearing some of the things that you guys are saying?
I think they're really, really interested and listening, but what they hear is a different matter. I think the problem is they don't want to hear about suggestions for policy changes that would take a long time, so longer term policy changes, because that's not how the political cycles work. They work in a much shorter time frame. So things like changing the whole assessment system, they don't really want to know about, because that is just not within a sort of a timescale of most governments. But they, I mean, my experience of working with policymakers is that they are really, really interested in research, and they want education policy to be more evidence-based. That the motivation is out there. It's just whether we can kind of meet in the middle and make suggestions that that are practical and feasible.
So the work that Learnus are doing, I suppose, at the moment, which is an attempt to take your ideas, some of your ideas and other people's ideas, and share those with teachers, with students, with parents, and sort of with the business community. That's it. You give the thumbs up, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a big motivator in my lab. We work a lot with policymakers, for example, and people in other areas, other sectors, and we do a lot of public engagement. We work a lot with schools, with teachers. I mean, what's the point of doing all this research if it's not going to have any impact in everyday life? That's what our aim is. And we think that a lot of our research and a lot of the research in this area is relevant to education policy. So the way to make progress there is to work with policymakers and other stakeholders in order to try to figure out how our evidence can have an impact and make a difference.
Wonderful. Any more information about the Blakemore Lab? How many researchers do you have? How many PhD students do you have? Is there a direction of travel?
I've always had about 10 people in my group. I try to keep it at that. That's the number that I prefer. It makes a very sort of nice, exciting, dynamic atmosphere where people work together. We always have projects that involve multiple people working on the same thing, so there's a lot of group work, but it also means that I can be involved in every project. Any more than that, I find it's beyond my capacity to keep up with what everyone's doing. So we have about 10 people. I think there are about 4 PhD students at any one time, and the other people are postdocs and research assistants.
I'm a research assistant here, which generally means that I work on a couple of different projects, and I've been in the lab for 2 years now. And I kind of did an undergrad in psychology and then a master's in cognitive neuroscience, and started doing some volunteering with adolescents and kind of like mental health in adolescents, and found it really valuable and interesting. So I wanted to kind of pursue research within that kind of area.
And can you tell us a little bit about, I believe it's called the CAM, is it CAM app?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Tell me about the CAM app, it sounds intriguing.
Yes, so the CAM app, or the Cambridge Mind App Study, was a study we launched a couple of years ago, and we've kind of just finished data collection for that now. And it's an online study kind of interested in how kind of like social interactions and virtual social interactions and everyday behaviours like technology use and sleep and physical activity all kind of link to our mood and mental health and other kind of like everyday behaviours like that.
So is it a sort of downloadable, or was it a downloadable app that you encourage students to use, or adolescents to use, or staff, teachers to use? Or?
Yeah, so we kind of, our kind of age range was 12 plus in the UK. So we kind of have anyone from age 12 above, and including adults. And we asked them to do weekly questionnaires online, which kind of looked at their general mood over the past week, how much social interaction they'd had, friends and family relationships, things like that. And then also excitingly, we had an app as well, which asked them daily questions on their mood, their social interactions, and also measured in the background kind of like their sleep and their physical activity and their kind of like daily technology use, so which apps they were using and for how long and things like that.
So the information has now come in. I suppose you've got a lot of data, so I presume you're spending a lot of time now data crunching, dare I call it data crunching? Or
yeah.
Statistical analysis?
Yeah, pretty much. So we've finished data collection a couple of months ago now, so we're still in the process of kind of like unravelling the findings and the kind of things that we're interested in looking at.
And you personally are interested in adolescent mental health?
Yeah.
Any particular, dare I say, type of mental health?
Kind of more just mood generally, kind of like depression and anxiety and things like that, and particularly around kind of like social influences and social factors around adolescent mental health and everyday behaviour.
Yeah, so social media, are we talking specifically about social media, the impact that possibly social media is or isn't having on adolescents?
Yeah, so the CAMAP study does have kind of social media measures, and we also asked them about their kind of virtual social interactions. So that'll be really interesting to see whether kind of those kinds of interactions can kind of remediate any effects from not having in-person social interactions, or any kind of other any relation to mood as well.
So my background is in social psychology, so I've always been interested in group dynamics, I guess, and societies. And working now with young people, I'm also more interested in how young people develop within their context, within their societies and their social groups. And for adolescents especially, one of the most important social environments that they're in is in friendship groups and peer groups. They become really important during this age. So I'm a bit interested in that interaction between how young people become themselves or get to learn about themselves in the social context that they're in. And right now I'm working on a project looking at friendships. So for example, quality of friendships and how that can be important for how we think about ourselves and difficulties that we might experience. But in the future, I also plan to study a bit more about family dynamics or neighborhood dynamics. So whether or not we interact with other people in our neighborhoods and how that can also be some kind of support for development in young people.
Sounds fascinating, but might I ask how you collect data on that sort of stuff? Are you just observing people's behaviour from afar, or?
It depends a little bit. So if I'm looking at friendships, usually I'll go into a school and I'll ask young people about their friendships. So this can be as broad as just asking them to think about their friends and asking about questions about their friendships. Or some people, I don't work with this kind of data, but some people do networks, so they ask them to name up to 5 friends that they might have, and then they create networks of the classroom, for example, and then try to relate different things to that. That's more if you're looking at individual level, more participant-based data. But of course, if you're going to look at more environmental measures or neighborhood measures, then you need much more data and a bit bigger data sets. And there's a lot of data sets like that, for example, in the UK, following cohorts of young people, so 4,000 young people, for example, and looking at wider level variables, what we call population variables. And that might also include things like socioeconomic status, more things like neighborhood factors, deprivation, and stuff like that. And that would be the kind of data sets that you would use to ask these kind of population questions that are a bit bigger, which is also what I intend to use in the future when I ask these questions.
Yeah, well, so I've always been a huge fan of Professor Blakemore's work, and I was applying to PhDs, and her lab and her research really fit well with my interest in adolescent development and mental health and brain development. So I reached out to her to apply for a PhD in 2020, which was right before COVID year hit us, and everything kind of went a little crazy. And then I interviewed with her. I was accepted here.
Via Zoom, I assume.
Yes, actually, and via Zoom. It was actually before COVID happened.
Okay.
But because we were so far, we did it via Zoom, Skype actually at the time. That was before Zoom. And then I had an interview with my funding body in person right before kind of COVID happened. And then moved over here in the fall of 2020 and am now in my 3rd year.
And you really like the Blakemore Lab?
Oh yeah, I love it here so much. Like, colleague Sarah is such an incredible supervisor, mentor, person. She's so kind, and really cares about us all, like as people and in addition to as scientists.
Wonderful, wonderful. And a little bit about your PhD. I've read something about stress.
Yes.
Is that what it's about?
Yeah, so my main PhD project is looking at social isolation. So I was really lucky to come in with my colleague Livia, who you'll speak to later. She's a postdoc in the lab, and she was starting this isolation study in adolescents. She was at MIT before and did this in adults, where she basically experimentally isolated participants for 10 hours and then did a brain scan and a bunch of other kind of cognitive tests. And we wanted to kind of replicate that in adolescents, and it was a really cool opportunity because I got to kind of add my own research questions into that project. So Livia is really interested in reward learning and things like that, and I'm interested in fear learning, which are kind of two kind of sort of opposite but a little bit different kind of constructs. And so I added...
Sound completely different.
Yeah, I think of them kind of, this is probably not scientifically accurate, but I think of them as kind of, there's like a pleasure pain, they're kind of like a reward pain fear kind of continuum, but whether that's actually opposite or, different mechanisms.
It's on a continuum. We'll agree with the continuum.
Well, I don't know, remains to be seen, I think. Okay. But anyway, yeah, I was interested in fear learning because it's really related to the development of things like anxiety. So basically when you pair an otherwise kind of neutral situation or cue with something that you're afraid of, you can sometimes start to associate that cue with anxiety itself. So I always give the example like public speaking. If you're really afraid of public speaking and you have to go into this certain classroom or something and give a speech, you might eventually start to have like kind of a panic reaction to the classroom itself. So that's kind of fear learning, pairing the feelings that you had for the event with the kind of neutral context. So we were interested in looking at how that might be affected by social isolation. So we actually brought teenagers into the lab and isolated them. Yeah. For 10 hours? No, so we did 3.5 to 4 hours in teens. Nothing. So firstly we piloted it to see, we wanted like comparable levels of loneliness as experienced in adults. So we did it we piloted it to see how long we would need to do that to get that kind of response, and that seemed to be about 3.5, 4 hours. They were in a room upstairs. They had lots of stuff. So they had like food, snacks, puzzles, games, things like that. They just didn't have any social contact. And we did one session like that, and then we did another session where they were allowed virtual interactions. So like their computers, social media, their phones, things like that. And we wanted to look at differences between isolation and baseline, and then also whether these kind of virtual interactions might remediate some of the effects of isolation.
So you've been doing that for 3 years. Are you sort of excited by the data that you're starting to find? You obviously can't tell me what the findings
really.
are.
Actually, we've had really, really promising results. First year was kind of planning. Second year was data collection, and now we've been really digging into the analysis. And we also have 7 Tesla brain scans of all the participants as well. So processing that and kind of digging into that data as well. Seemed really promising results. It seems like isolation does have an influence on these kind of fear learning processes, and that at least for fear learning, it's not really mitigated by virtual interactions.
I am so going to go back and look up fear learning. Very interesting. And your plans for the future? You love Cambridge, or
I do. I really Georgia? I miss the weather in the US, I will say, although today is like an incredibly beautiful day. Mm-hmm. If it was like this every day, I would love it. But I really like Cambridge. It's like the perfect size, and it's really fun to like the college system. You have all your friends in college and department and stuff, so it's quite fun. I'm not sure yet. I'm starting an internship over the summer with the Department for Education with the UK government, to look at, they have a bunch of longitudinal data sets looking at learning outcomes in education and mental health. So we'll be hopefully incorporating some of that into my PhD. And I'm not sure after that, probably postdoc at some point.
Fantastic.
I got really interested in studying these questions in adolescents. So adolescents is a developmental period in our lives where social contact is really important. And so I was really interested how that affects young people when they experience loneliness. So how does that affect their brains and their cognition?
And you're currently engaged in supervising a PhD, but doing your own research as well?
Right. So I'm co-supervising one PhD student together with Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, and she's interested in looking at how loneliness and isolation affect fear processing, and the research direction I'm focusing on more is about reward. So how does being alone or deprived of social contact, how does that affect our reward system, our reward learning, and how much we seek rewards?
Are you able to give me a little bit more about rewards learning? I presume reward learning to me is rewarding people, so providing a carrot, so to speak.
Right, so the way we study it is that we let them figure out in an experimental paradigm which kinds of actions will give them the most reward. So there are certain psychological paradigms that we can use to do that. So for example, the one that we used is the reinforcement learning paradigm. So people need to figure out through trial and error which, for example, box they tick will give them more rewards, and then we switch which box will give them more rewards, and they again need to figure this out on their own. So we can then use computational modeling to figure out how quickly they learned across the whole task, and also how quickly they changed or how flexible they were in their learning when we switch reward contingencies. So that allows us then to quantify reward learning.
And I presume on in a sense, a day-to-day basis, collecting that sort of data, you've got to isolate them, you have to leave them on their own for a period of time. Is that the plan?
We found that both types of learning are increasing, which is in line with animal research. So there's actually quite a lot of animal research on isolation that we based our hypotheses on either the reward domain and the fear domain. And what we find is quite in line with animal research, which is that it looks like isolation or the experience of loneliness increases reward seeking in young people, and it also appears to increase fear learning as well.
Oh, really interesting. And so where would you go in the future with that? Or are you done with reward learning now? I presume not.
No, not at all. No,
Yeah.
So there are quite a few new questions that kind of came up in these studies. So one thing that I'm particularly interested in is the brain. So I'm really interested in then studying whether, so now this was a behavioral study, but what are the neural kind of correlates of this kind of change in reward seeking? Is it really the reward system that changes, or is it perhaps cognitive control that decreases? So we can ask these questions using brain measures. So this is sort of the next step I want to do in my research.
So the one you've just done, that didn't include any fMRI scans or anything?
Not as outcome measures, no.
Okay.
No.
And in future, you were hoping to go down that sort of route?
Right, yeah,
Okay.
that's the plan, yeah. I'm also really interested in the interaction between loneliness and social media use. So we had a kind of, a part of the study was also looking at when participants had access to virtual social interactions but were isolated from real life interactions, whether that remediated effects of loneliness, and we found that partially it did, but partially it also induced its own effects. So I kind of want to follow up on these results that we had there in more detail.
So one of the really big things that comes out is socioeconomic status, or kind of socioeconomic deprivations, things like parental income, employment level, neighbourhood deprivation, and those factors seem to be really strong predictors. And that's something that we've known from lots of educational research, that children who grow up in less advantaged households tend to have less positive outcomes across a wide range of kind of cognitive factors, academic factors, and to some extent also mental health and cognition. So some of the research I'm doing in Sarah's lab is utilising other large-scale data sets to look at things like food poverty.
So can we backpedal just slightly? So you left Duncan's lab in Cambridge, and you joined Sarah-Jayne's lab, the Blakemore lab here. Was there a reason you had, I don't know, applied for different sort of funding, or you were taking your ideas to a different level here? Or it's just a brilliant lab?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to have a little bit of change. I think Sarah had some funding from the Myriad project, as someone previously left, and there's about a year's left of funding. So I've used some of that kind of time period between last March and now to look at some of the Myriad data. They've already looked at, so the Myriad study is a large trial, primarily looking at the effects of school-based mindfulness intervention and comparing that to psychological control. So that was all done by loads of brilliant scientists before I arrived. And the primary findings were that the intervention didn't seem to work very well. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether kind of school-based interventions aren't necessarily the best approach.
That sort of made it into the press, I seem to remember.
There's been a lot of discussion about it.
There was a bit of reporting on that.
The study does not conclude that mindfulness isn't helpful, but just maybe this particular training program didn't really engage the students they were looking at.
So what are you doing in at the Blakemore lab then?
So I'm using kind of secondary data sets primarily to answer questions about cognition, mental health, and development, quite generally. We're using some of the myriad data. They've collected rich data during lockdown, and we're looking a little bit at kind of what factors predicted mental health during lockdown, what factors predicted which adolescents adhered to lockdown rules, because there's very rich baseline data and a variety. The findings are still, they're not really published yet, so it's still kind of in flux. One of the main findings that we think will hopefully hold is that adolescents were more susceptible to social influence, in particular negative social influence, were more likely to report not adhering to lockdown rules. And that kind of matches with the literature we know in adults. So there's some literature to suggest that things like news reports of kind of governmental figures not adhering to lockdown rules may have influenced kind of population level behaviour. And there's also lots of research in adolescents about the importance of, or the strength of social influence and peer influence on social behaviour.
Interesting stuff. Interesting. And later on, your ideas are to continue, I suppose, at the Blakemore lab with. Sounds like you're doing some data crunching.
Yeah, primarily. Some of the research questions I'm interested in kind of inherently are quite difficult to investigate as a single investigator to collect all the data you need. So some of the data sets that we're looking at involve kind of tens of thousands of adolescents assessed over kind of very long time.
Where do you get that information from? These are meta
studies. So it depends. Sometimes you have colleagues who've collected data. For example, the Myriad trial will have a large team from kind of UCL, Cambridge, and the MRC, CBU who've collected data. Kind of collaborating with individuals like in Oxford, and some data sets that we use in the lab, for example, the ABCD study, are collected by a large cohort of investigators in the States. And they open up the data so other teams around the world can use it to answer the questions that the original investigators wouldn't have necessarily had when they were planning the study.
Great science, sharing.
Yeah, that's kind of the future of kind of open science. And,
excellent. Direction of travel, I suppose. Where to next? Are you focused more specifically on the social side of things? You're not particularly interested at the moment in the biopsychology, I suppose, or the cellular level.
Ooh, interesting you should mention that. We've just applied for a grant to look at the cellular level.
Exciting.
Okay, so I mean, we're interested in our research going in multiple directions. One is, I've always been interested in social cognition, and I still am, and our work and others has pointed to adolescence as being a sensitive period of social development. Isolation can lead to loneliness. We know loneliness is firstly a big risk factor in mental health problems. We also know, interestingly, that young people, 16 to 24-year-olds, report being the most lonely in our society. Contrary to what you might think elderly people would report being most lonely, but it isn't. It's the 16 to 24-year-olds, which is there's something very intriguing about that, because 16 to 24-year-olds are also the people who are on social media the most. So in some ways they're connected more than any other age group, but they still feel the most lonely. And so there's something really important to understand there.
Is there insecurity there, I suppose? Is there a lack of confidence?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question of why this is, and it's something recent, by the way. It's a recent trend. It wasn't always that way. And there's one question to be asked about whether social media has this paradoxical effect of actually making you feel more isolated, even though you're connected more. It's an interesting question that we don't really know the answer to.
So much more to discuss there, it really is. Dare we go into COVID and lockdown? Did you manage to, pick up anything about what happened during that massive experiment where teenagers were locked away and made to feel isolated, and the only way they could keep in touch, I suppose, was through social media and shouting through windows?
Yes, well, we have been doing some research on COVID, the effects of COVID, and particularly isolation, lockdowns, school closures on adolescent mood and cognition and mental health. But most of the work actually has been done by other people. For example, I mean, many people around the world have done this, but a colleague at Cambridge called Professor Tamsin Ford, she's the head of the psychiatry department, and she runs she's a psychiatric epidemiologist, and she runs very large studies looking at the changes in mental health in adolescents, children and adolescents, over the last 20 years. And yes, so that her surveys, just like many others around the world, showed that on average mental health deteriorated during COVID in young people. But it's a bit more nuanced and complex than that, actually, because that was true for a very large proportion of young people. Their mental health, for example, their mood lowered during COVID, but a small but significant proportion, it was the opposite was true, and they were actually happier during school closures. And that, I think, is something that, you know, we were talking about implications for education policy earlier. In some ways, I feel like that is an important finding that has also been replicated in other countries that could have had implications for schooling, and has been kind of lost and neglected in all the other, you know, chaos and catch-up that we've had to do around COVID. But for some children, it seems that going to school is stressful. I mean, we kind of knew that anyway. Yeah. But preventing them from going to school, was a good thing for some children. And I think, you know, we really have to question this one-size-fits-all system we have for young people, particularly, for example, young people with neurodiversity, who really, or young people who are bullied, who really struggle.
Possibly more homeschooling needs to be maybe thrown into the mix.
Well, we should just consider everything based on this evidence.
So one more thing from me specifically, I've always found that the teenage brain in particular is really good at memorising things, which is quite remarkable. Is that something that's there in the research that people are doing? They're really good at memorising lyrics and I don't know, quotes from Shakespeare, if they like Shakespeare.
Oh yeah. I mean, that is absolutely
it's like
makes sense.
Superpower.
Yes, knowing about their brains and how they're developing, that makes complete sense. So we know that the brain undergoes a large amount of development across the teenage years and into the 20s. In terms of its structure, so the amount of grey matter and the amount of white matter it contains. So the brain is actually adult size by about age 8 or 9. The overall volume of the brain doesn't change very much, but its composition, its internal structure changes dramatically. And it also changes in terms of its function, how it's used, how it's activated, and the connections between different areas change. And what we now think, so adolescent neuroscientists now think of adolescence as a sensitive period of brain development in which neuroplasticity is heightened. So neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change according to the environment. That is how we learn information. Now, neuroplasticity is actually present throughout life. Whenever you learn something new, that's because neurons in your brain have changed their pathways, for example. There's no age limit to neuroplasticity, but what we know is that neuroplasticity is heightened in childhood and in adolescence, which is why they are often better at learning new information.
And they are very good at learning and recording new information. Finally then, Blakemore Lab is running, it's very successful, congratulations, but is there anything that you are, anything else on the horizon that you're really excited about doing? Maybe with the Blakemore Lab, or maybe with that brilliant bit of drama that you did a couple of years ago now, about 6 years ago?
So I'll focus on one science thing and one public engagement thing. So you mentioned earlier cellular changes in adolescent brains. Now, the knowledge of the adolescent brain in humans has been revolutionised by the ability to scan the living human brain, particularly with MRI scanning. But we've reached a kind of impasse because MRI currently only has the resolution to tell us about macrostructural changes in the brain, changes at the level of the white matter and the grey matter. Underneath that, there are lots of cellular changes happening that you can see if you study, for example, animal brains or post-mortem human brain tissue, but you can't see with MRI scans because currently they just don't have the resolution to tell us about the brain at the level of the cell or the synapse. But that is changing, and I think, looking ahead over the next 10 or 20 years, I think things will change dramatically in that sphere. It's basically MRI physics. And at some point soon, we really will learn a lot about what's changing at the cellular level in the human adolescent brain, and that's something I'm excited about getting involved with, for example, with my colleague Derek Jones at the University of Cardiff, who's really a pioneer in this area.
You're talking biochemical level? You're talking genetic level?
No.
As in switching on genes level?
Well, you can do that. I mean, you can look at genotype and how different genotypes are associated with different levels of different types of brain development. But no, I'm talking about actually imaging the brain at a higher resolution.
Okay.
So it's like, if you have a picture with a certain resolution of number of pixels, it's like increasing that number of pixels in an MRI scan, so you can see at a deeper microstructural level.
Getting down to synaptic level?
Maybe one day, yes.
Wow, that would be exciting.
So that's a scientific area that I'm really excited about being involved with, hopefully, over the next decade or so. In terms of public engagement, yes, I mean, you mentioned the play, which was Brainstorm, that was...
At the Young Vic, I think.
The National Theatre. It was directed by Ned Glazier at Company 3, and it's a play that was written by, led by, performed by teenagers about the teenage brain. So me and my former PhD student, Kate Mills, she's now a professor in an American university. We worked with these teenagers. We told them everything we knew about the teenage brain. They went away, they asked questions, they went away and they came back with a script about the changes that teenagers go through from their point of view. And then they performed this amazing play, and it had, critical acclaim, 2 runs at the National Theatre. It was brilliant, and it was one of the best things I've been involved with in my life.
Yeah, congratulations. And would you want to continue with that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I do still do quite a lot of public engagement work. I have fairly recently written a book trying to summarise our research on the adolescent brain, aimed at a non-specialist audience. And yes, I mean, it's something that I'm still keen to keep involved with.
Wonderful, wonderful. We won't take any more of your time. Can I just say from a personal level that you've been an inspiration. So
Thank you.
A lot of the stuff that you've done has really had a huge impact on, certainly in the teaching profession. So
Thank
sincere,
you.
hand on heart, thank you as well.
Coming to the lab and meeting us all.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Seriously, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.